Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Sounds familiar, right? Sure, it is the third word of instruction in those 10 commandments that were revealed to Moses by God on Mount Sinai. And I imagine for most of us, we have come to think of this specific commandment as instruction to set aside this day. Set it apart as a day for rest, a day that we also gather for worship. But looking at this week's reading from Deuteronomy, there were a few things about this instruction that I never noticed before. Dr. Vanessa Lovelace, an associate professor of the Hebrew Bible, reminds us that this Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, literally the word Decalogue means 10 words, that it can be found in the Torah, what we know as the first 5 books of the Bible. Now, the word Torah in Hebrew it's a noun, and a common translation of this word is law. But when we define Torah as law, it can lead to a misinterpretation, especially for those of us in Christian traditions. We think of the law as a strict legal code. Well, unfortunately, that misunderstanding is sometimes further supported when we read these texts about the religious leaders of Jesus' day who emphasized the letter of the law above and beyond the spirit of the law. So actually, though, the term Torah is more accurately translated as instruction or teaching. So the Torah is really better understood as a collection. I mean, it's the entire 5 books there at the beginning. So it includes story narratives as well as legal texts that all make up the core teachings for Jewish faith and life in practice. So another important detail that is often overlooked is that there are 2 distinct versions of the Decalogue. I mean, the most commonly cited version, I think, for us comes from Exodus in the 20th chapter, the first 17 verses. But then there is this lesser known, yet very close parallel in Deuteronomy, from which we heard read this morning. So today I want us to look closer at this parallel. If you'd like to follow along, there are some Pew Bibles. You can open the Pew Bible to Exodus 20, the beginning of that chapter. And you can hold out your bulletin and turn it to the first reading from Deuteronomy. Maybe there's not enough Bibles or you don't want to look in it, so just open your minds and you can follow along with me. Now, if we look really closely, we'll find that structurally there is actually little difference between these 2 versions. Both open up with a historical prologue that gives the occasion for the covenant. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. It's both in Exodus 20, verse 2, and Deuteronomy 5, verse 6. Then both offer a list of stipulations. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God. It's the same, both Exodus and Deuteronomy. But then we get to the Sabbath and discover that there is a significant difference. Now, at first, the differences might appear to be insignificant. I mean, we begin at Exodus 20, verse 8 is where Sabbath is, and it says, remember, using the Hebrew word zakar, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Whereas Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 12 begins with observe. It's the Hebrew word shamar. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. Now, perhaps the writer chose to use the word shamar, which is observe, but it also could be translated to keep the Sabbath day. Perhaps that's intentional, because if we think about to remember, it might suggest naming or calling something to mind. Whereas to keep implies more of a habitual continuance or causing to continue a course of action. I think they're both important, remembering and observing. Now, both versions of the Decalogue allot for 6 days of laboring. And yet, the difference then lies in the motivation for keeping the Sabbath. In the Exodus version, which I think we're more familiar with, we are reminded of the creation story all the way back in Genesis. And the rationale for the Sabbath in Genesis 1 is that after God has finished speaking creation into existence over the 6-day period, God rested, Shabbat, on the 7th day. God blessed it and set it apart from the other days. And in imitation of God, we then are expected to honor every 7th day as set apart from the others, because that's what God did, what God taught us to do. But if we look at Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 15, the reason for keeping the Sabbath is not because God rested on the 7th day, but because God rescued Israel during the Exodus experience. God rescued them from slavery in Egypt. In other words, the people were to keep the Sabbath in remembrance of their enslavement in Egypt and the freedom that God brought them. It follows actually in the Jewish prayer spoken before and after the Sabbath meal. It includes the words, "Once we were slaves in Egypt, and now we are free people." I appreciate this difference because I think it can open us up to an experience of the Sabbath that is even deeper than simply resting. Certainly it is a time to rest and to help others rest, as that's what the balance of life demands. And it is a time when we acknowledge that God is the source of our existence. That's why we gather in worship. But it's more than that. As theologian Gustavo Gutierrez states, we must not forget the reason for this rule. It's the liberation from the slavery endured in Egypt. Liberation. Freedom. The observance of the Sabbath is an ongoing celebration of freedom. The freedom of our spiritual ancestors, but also our own freedom too. I think keeping the Sabbath invites us to remember our own deliverance. And this is a freedom that we have because of Jesus' love and sacrifice for us. But it is also a liberation that we have experienced when we recognize God's action in our lives. God's liberating us from our own Egypts. When we take time to remember that freedom and give thanks to God for the whole journey of our lives, we can experience the true gift of the Sabbath, which is not just a day of rest after a week of labor, but includes a repeated celebration of God's providence and God's presence and God's ongoing power in our lives. It actually reminds me of one of the meditations we did during Lent on our Monday meditations. And I want to offer it to you as a Sabbath activity. It's called Stages of the Journey and comes from the book 50 Ways to Pray by Teresa Blythe. And it's about naming our own Egypt experiences, our own wilderness journeys, and trusting that God is leading us to our promised land. Now, we don't have time to complete the entire meditation fully in this time, but I want to give you the outline, and I hope that you will take some time to go through this process in hopes that you will enhance your experience of Sabbath. So we begin by thinking about a pivotal time in your life, a time when you needed to be rescued. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be a time of great oppression or great hardship, but it certainly can be. This is the time to name your Egypt. Once you have done that, move your thoughts to the time that followed the exit from your Egypt. Did it involve wandering and seeking, similar to the Israelites? Were there stops along the way? Perhaps you are still there in a wilderness stage in your life. What is that like for you? The next step in the meditation takes you to your own Mount Horeb. Remember, it was at Mount Horeb, also known as Mount Sinai, where Moses received revelation from God. So consider, along your life's journey, was there a time of revelation for you? A time when you knew God was speaking to you? An event for which you have deep, fond, loving memories? Is that revelation experience connected to your wilderness trek? And we know that Mount Horeb was a special place for the Israelites. They would have loved to have stayed there. We often want to stay in a place where we feel especially connected to God, but we can't stay at the mountain forever because it is not the promised land. Just as the Israelites had to move on, so do we in order to enter your promised land. So take some time to think about what is your promised land. Describe it. What has God promised to you? Have you received it yet? What do you need to move toward? Maybe you see a connection between a Mount Horeb revelation and where you have ended up, or where you are heading. Once you have taken time to journey through these stages, end your meditation by giving thanks to God for the journey and for God's gift of this Sabbath, this time to remember and observe and to keep. May you know that the Sabbath was created for you, for your rest and for your remembrance of God's deliverance in your life. And may you remember that you have been freed for love, for a life loving God, loving your fellow humanity, loving all of creation. And may you always feel to the depth of your being that God is your hope, your rescue, your mighty hand and outstretched arm. Thanks be to God. Amen.